thing. Rumour has it that Colin's mistress, the wife of a convict, didn't like the place. They were leaving because one woman didn't like it. Buckley wasn't going to have any of this. So every convict was told that out there, in the unknown hinterland of the bush in Australia, man-eaters proliferated. Buckley wanted to get to Sydney, about 1,000 kilometres distant. The convicts in those days had no clue. Many thought China was the next place after Sydney. You got to Sydney and then you find yourself in China. Fleeing north was described, it was literally described as China travelling. So Buckley and 5 others fled just after Christmas 1803 with about 3 days of rations, a few pots and pans, a second-rate gun and a kettle. By the second day, 3 of them had given up. In the next week or so, he and his 2 mates became the first white men to skirt the entire inner coastal rim of Port Phillip. And they were pretty spent. Most of the food had gone. 2 of his mates went back, happy to bear the whip and the stocks. So there he was, all alone. William Buckley, a man from Cheshire, 22 years old. He decided to stay on in the bush. He thought he could handle it. So there he was, looking out on Bass Strait, entirely alone. Who was he? Well, one thing you need to know about William Buckley was he was, even by today's standards, he was gargantuan. He was 6'5" and 7/8, so let's call him 6'6", and extremely strong and athletic. Like many of his kind, being a farm boy from Cheshire, he was totally illiterate, couldn't read. He'd seen his family's tiny plot of land in Cheshire stolen by the Crown, and had then been apprenticed as a bricklayer, become a soldier, and was wounded in Holland fighting the French against Napoleon. He was then sent down to the colonies for handling stolen cloth. He protested his innocence to no avail. Buckley was a 22-year-old convict who'd been told all his life what to do. Sent here, told to do that, requisitioned for something, ordered to do something else. For Buckley, and I borrow here an existential expression, the hell of his life was other people. That was the state, the army, the penal authorities, and even his mates who had led him astray. Finally, here he was alone on the Victorian shores. He had his freedom. What kind of freedom was it? It was pretty rough freedom. But at least there was nothing else telling him what to do. For several months he subsisted the best he could. He picked up oysters and abalones here. He ate pig face. He said it tasted like watermelon. He ate berries and licked the dew off leaves because he didn't know how to find water, but somehow he licked the dew off leaves. He found some water in puddles. By the time he was eventually found by the Wadawurrung people, he was close to death. Finally, here came what you would call, or what I would call, Buckley's chance. Just before the local people found him, he'd come across a grave mound with a spear embedded at the top. So there's a mound with a big spear right at the top of it. Half-starved and weak, he thought it might assist him to hunt, or just as a prop to help him walk. When not long after a group of Wadawurrung women found him unconscious by a stream, they saw the spear. They believed he was the man from that grave. A man from that grave who had returned to them. Buckley was now a bit like Lazarus, but much better, and I'll explain that. As returned kin, as he was believed to be returned kin by the Wadawurrung people, he was treated like long-lost family. He was now a man called Murrungurk, and his survival and comfort was his new families, because now he had a new family. It was their top priority was to look after him. They weren't going to let Murrungurk die twice. So Buckley's great stroke of fortune was that among many Indigenous tribes, white people were thought not just to be reincarnated, but returned countrymen. How did this work? Buckley was seen as what the Wadawurrung people called a namaji, a resuscitated, reincarnated Aboriginal person. The Indigenous people believed everyone belonged to country by powerful spiritual bonds. We've heard this. They also believed the cosmos was finite. There were no other countries. There were no other states. When Europeans came, these white ghost-like people had to be from where they were from. They were coming back to their country. Many also witnessed that in the embalming process, the cadaver turned pale, and in time it turned chalk white. So when you died, they surmised you came back as a white person. There's a really funny, not that funny, but there is an intriguing story, perhaps is the way to put it, of a local Indigenous man who was condemned to death in 1842. This is after Buckley's time. The magistrate later said that that man was very, very happy because he knew he would, after he'd been hanged, he would come back white. And he said, "This is all very good." This is my bad accent. "Very good. Me jump up, white fellow. Plenty of sixpence for me now." So in other words, he thought he's come back a rich man if he was white. It says a lot. Conversely, all it took for Indigenous people to see a white person as kin was a small mannerism, a body tick, or even just a similar smile. Anything that was similar to the person they believed you had been, if it inspired recognition, you were that person. Buckley had the spear, and that was enough. In the 1840s, there's a story of a Victorian settler called Charles Gray, who was recognised as an Aboriginal woman's long-lost husband. He now found that he had an entirely new family who visited him regularly and said hello. He became not Charles Gray, but Tirut Marie, because he was the man come back. So now Buckley, the new Murrungurk, he had a sister, he had a brother-in-law, he had 2 nephews and a niece. And his new family treated him as if he was the original Murrungurk, with great love and affection. What could Buckley do? He was now, using a familiar term, he was now embedded. He simply shrugged and said, "Okay, I'll go along for the ride." So far, so good. But it's not that easy. As kin, he now found that he had newfound obligations. He had to know his place, learn the ways of his clan, know his country. But the most important thing he had to understand of all the Aboriginal culture was a thing we know. We call it mateship, they call it kinship. Kinship is still the cornerstone of Aboriginal Indigenous culture. Everything rests on it. Kin determines when you speak, what you eat, where you sleep, and what you wear, even down to who you're allowed to have a joke with. So now Buckley is embedded, he's Murrungurk. But it's not that easy, as I said. There's all sorts of new cultural rules and protocols he would have to learn. And some he could never get his head around. The one concept that would give him a lot of trouble, and that was how his tribe viewed those who were not kin. If you weren't kin, and there were no tribal affiliations and relationships, the relationship went totally the other way. The first Victorians believed that all the far-off others, distant tribes, they believed they were all, without exception, they were all sorcerers. They were what they called gulum gulum. An easy translation for this is foreigners. Perhaps more clearly it meant wild, bad people. They were seen to speak a strange language. They were not linked by marriage. They were distant, and they all practiced sorcery. So here he is embedded into this new culture. Later in his life, when he was with his tribe, the Wadawurrung people, they were hosting a man from one of these peripheral tribes. That man trod over a log and was bitten by a snake. Buckley's Wadawurrung clan gave him a really good funeral, a fine funeral. He was put on a bough of logs and leaves, placed high on a tree, his face tilted towards the sunset. A fire was burning under the tree to keep him warm on his journey to the spirit world. But then came the revenge party. Because Buckley's brother-in-law had stayed in a tent with this man who had been killed by the snake, the man's relatives sought him out and right in front of Buckley's eyes killed him savagely. Then they hunted down and killed his sister and one of his nephews. What had happened here? The Victorian tribes believed there wasn't such a thing as misadventure. The snake had not killed the man. It was sorceries from Buckley's brother-in-law which had guided the snake to do it. His brother-in-law had, quote, carried him, this is what Buckley said, he said his brother-in-law had carried with him something that occasioned his death. This form of payback was extremely well known. The Indigenous people always blamed far-off tribes for unnatural deaths. Buckley's Wadawurrung clan were the far-off tribe. They were being blamed for the unnatural death, and they were even blamed for some natural ones. This is something that Buckley had great trouble coming to terms with. He was so affected by the death of his sister, brother-in-law, and one of his nephews that he fled, he went bush. He fled Aboriginal life, spending years and years alone. The men who slew his family promptly asked Buckley, if you can believe this, to come and spend some time with them. It was as if they were telling Buckley that this wasn't personal, this is just business, this is the way things are done. This is a stark example of how Buckley could never fully come to terms as being an Indigenous person, an Aboriginal man. I'll take a break here. I mean, I first heard about Buckley from an art aficionado, a friend of mine who loves the art world. He was telling me about a painting he saw of the giant man. He said, "This is a real Courtenay story," he said. "You have to do it." It had everything. A white man among Indigenous people who became just like them. Buckley lost his English language. He was in the wilderness. He was with the Wadawurrung people for 32 years. He lost his entire ability to speak English. He learned to hunt and forage. Maybe I thought, when I first heard of this, at the very beginning, oh, it sounds like a great story about Robinson Crusoe in Australia, something like that. It might be a really good story. But when you get into something like this, you realise there's a lot more to it. To do this sort of story justice, you have to immerse yourself in the world that Buckley had immersed himself in. You had to know the Aboriginal names for important parts of country. You had to be able to explain Aboriginal culture, their language, their religion, their way of life, their adaptation to geography, their myths and dreaming. That's not to forget their farming practices, their hunting methods, marriage practices, rules of warfare and initiation rites. Then there's funeral rites, eating habits, foods, medicines, clothing, tribal politics and forms of governance, as well as kinship rules that I talked about, and the protocols which underpinned all those intertribal relations I just said something about. And then you've got to look at the Indigenous view of white people. What do they think of us? Their view of non-country tribes. And the whole story, this is, of settler and Aboriginal relationship. Then you have to mention the colonial history of Victoria and Tasmania, all the while telling Buckley's personal story. So what I'm really telling you here is this is one difficult story to tell if you want to do it properly. I hope I did it right. Only you the readers, can judge. But what I'm trying to say here is that all the above is what makes Buckley, the Buckley story, I think, and I would say this because I wrote it, but I think it's what makes it so rich. And why, and I think, and people ask me, why should we give it any preeminence over other stories? There were a number of what I term other white people marooned, and I use that word very, very loosely, marooned with Indigenous people in Australia in the late 18th century and throughout the 19th. There are quite a few stories of men and women who became part of Aboriginal tribes, some for many, many years. One of the stark differences with this Buckley story and all the others is no one else ever, in my opinion, and I read all the other stories about other people with Aboriginal people, no one else ever got so close to their distinctive culture as Buckley did. He arguably engaged with his Indigenous saviours, because they were his saviours, at a much higher level than any of the others. Many of those, I'm not to say they didn't immerse themselves very deeply. That they all learned how to survive. But the thing about Buckley was he really did, I think, become a Wadawurrung man. Buckley caught glimpses, for instance, of what his host called a bunyip. We've all heard of the bunyip. He even says he went hunting for it. And he doesn't say that with any joke at all. Buckley told his story as if he too believed the Wadawurrung view of life, I should say. He actively engaged in their folklore legends, such as the Bunyip I just mentioned. He had sexual liaisons, he fathered a child and children, preferred their foods over white foods. There's one instance, I think, and I mentioned in the book, he refused to eat a white man's pork and beans offered to him on a nice plate, and instead went to the nearest tree and with an axe cut out all the grubs in the tree. It is also claimed that Buckley became, and I probably don't even pronounce this properly, but what they call an Rangeta, and that's an elder person. This very much, that means a man of elder respect. This very much distinguishes him from other people who lived with the indigenous peoples. Most of the others were not necessarily seen as Namaji, the resuscitated kin, but he was more than that. He was an elder man, like an elder statesman within his tribe. Most of the others owed their survival probably due to pity or charity or just plain luck or just the generosity of the people they fell in with, just took them in and looked after them. None of the others balked at rejoining British civilization either, or Australian civilization, whatever you want to call it, white civilization. Buckley, by his own admission, had several occasions when he could have sought out help from sealers and whalers in the vicinity around where he was in Port Phillip. But arguably he had become so indigenized that he thought better of it. And let's not forget, of course, let's not forget the fact that if he said, "Hi, I'm William Buckley," they might have said, "You're an escapee, you've got to go back and change." So there's a pretty good reason not to go back to the whites. But he showed no interest in actually even making contact with white people. He had sound reasons, as I said, for returning to Europe, not to return to European society. But he wasn't marooned. He was never marooned like others who went back. He was never marooned among the Aboriginal people. He was one of them. He genuinely loved them, and they loved him as a genuine Indigenous person. His status underscores what you often hear. Contemporary Aboriginal people often repeat the assertions that Aboriginality, for want of a better word, has nothing to do with the colour of your skin. This, I think, is what sets Buckley apart. The others might have been loved, possibly as adopted kin, but for the Wadawurrung, Buckley was categorically a Wadawurrung man. Others learnt the language, gathered the foods, came to dress like Aboriginal people and behave like Aboriginal people. But none of them could lay claim to being Indigenous and subsequently had to deal with such a terrible struggle about leaving the people who basically saved his life. And this is when we come to the second part of the story. This is the 1835. As people will know, or may or may not know, that's when Melbourne was actually, they had the failed one in 1803 in Sorrento that I talked about when it was abandoned. And in 1835 came a man called John Batman. And that was the year Batman and his party first came to Wadawurrung land and eventually settled in Melbourne. I haven't at this point mentioned John Batman, the bounty hunter. He's the bounty hunter of the story. John Batman's story is better known to the world at large, and particularly, as I said, to Victorians. He was seen as the so-called founder of Victoria, or the co-founder. He made a bogus treaty with the Wurundjeri people around Melbourne, claiming 600,000 hectares of land around Melbourne, which is, of course, a complete sham. The so-called treaty was forever contested by a man called John Fawkner, who tried to take the mantle as founder, but Fawkner himself settled on the Yarra several weeks before Batman. Batman and Fawkner, who were they? They were really the archetypal settlers whom Buckley was asked to work with. But really, as I see it, if the reason for these men to be in a territory was to ransack, steal, appropriate and profit, which is what they were there for, often using the guise of Christianity and civilization as a so-called legitimating force behind their actions, then you'll understand what Buckley was really up against. He'd been in the wilderness, as I said before, for 32 years. He had had enough difficulty acclimatising into Aboriginal life, and as I told you, he lost some of his family and he suffered quite badly. Now he had to deal with the onslaught of rapacious settlers. They say it was Batman who discovered the area. We still talk about white man discovering and naming places, but it was always, this is what we as Australians I think need to know, it was always a native or someone like Buckley, who was practically a native, who guided them. It was the same all over Australia. European exploration amounted to Aboriginal dispossession. So every single act of discovery in the Port Phillip region when the settlers came after 1835, every single act of discovery, every place that was named and later colonised was aided and assisted by Indigenous guides. They had to lead the expeditions, they had to guide them, they had to translate for them, and they had to feed them. It was their diplomacy, knowledge and bush skills that enabled settlers to reach the parts that would have been otherwise closed to them. And it was in this discovery period in the mid-1830s that Batman and his ilk kept up a kind of deception that they were here to help, here to work with the local people, here to be their partners. This was absolutely BS. Buckley was given the job of intermediary. He was a translator, because obviously he spoke the Wadawurrung tongue after 32 years. And he was a sort of intermediary in the go-between in the new colony, but his problem was he was really being forced to play a double game. He was his dilemma in one. The more he helped the colonists to do all that discovery that I talked about, the more he found himself mouthing their egregious intentions. The more he helped, the quicker he ushered in the destruction of his people, meaning the Wadawurrung. His job was to solve all the minor flare-ups, patch up any sort of misunderstandings or disputes, while the business of wholesale appropriation carried on in the background. It was sort of, the way Melbourne started was, it started out really respectfully, even sheepishly. It's a bit like Sydney, in fact. But as they grew in number, the most criminal among them knew what was needed was an excuse to begin hostilities and clear the land of all the Aboriginal people in the area. What they needed was an excuse, and that excuse was the murder of a senior colonist, a guy called Charles Franks, who, it's worth noting, was known to poison the Aborigines on the land he settled on. That was their payback for him poisoning them. But up till then, the colonists had been very nice and quiet and not caused any trouble. They had stayed their hand and remained calm. But once Frank's murder had happened, that changed everything. They now had the numbers, the weapons and the excuse. It was a signal to start the naked conquest. Finally, there is a view I have heard that when Buckley finally left Melbourne in 1837, 2 years after it was founded, he went to Hobart. There are many who say he sold his people out. In fact, when I went down to Geelong, the Wadawurrung people there, they think that Buckley is he's a traitor, he's a sellout. I don't quite agree with the way they see it, because he didn't have any choice but to sell out. He'd been selling them out much sooner, almost from the start. Every time he issued a white man's order in the local language or guided a colonial party through country, he was compromised. He left because he couldn't continue to be Judas to his adopted people. At the heart of it all was a wretched self-awareness that his job was to deceive the people he loved. As I said before, there are other stories of white men and women who have lived for long periods with the Aboriginals, but none which place a central character so strategically at the heart of history. Buckley was at the sharpest point of competing interests, and he suffered accordingly. Many of his own people no doubt saw him as the pawn of the invaders, a traitor, as I said. What did the white people think of him? The white people thought he was half a savage and treated him with contempt. He couldn't play on both sides, so he decided to play with none of them. As I said earlier on, it was always the other people who caused Buckley hell. He'd spent a life helping other people, and the other people had given him pretty much nothing back but disdain. He simply came to that same existential conclusion that so many of us are forced to come to terms with at some point in our lives, that either we live to be somebody else's instrument or we don't. He decided he would be no man's man other than his own. No wonder then that the phrase Buckley's chance that we started off with, no wonder then that the phrase Buckley's chance means you've pretty much got no hope. But think again when you use the expression, you've got Buckleys. This was a guy who, given half the chance, did pretty well under some pretty difficult circumstances. So look, thanks very much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the book. And if you've got any questions, I'd love to answer them. So thanks for listening. So my hearing's a bit out, so if I ask you to, it's just got bad hearing at the moment. Sorry.
When he left the Aborigines, he must have been about his mid-50s?
Yes, he was. He was about 50, he was born, he was about 55, I think, in 1837. I should remember all this sort of stuff, but I think he was born in 1880. Right. Yeah, so yeah, he was 55. He was middle-aged bloke.
Does he have any descendants today?
I get that question all the time. There's lots of people say that they're descended from William Buckley, and it's impossible to know because there's no records among the Aboriginal. He would have only had Aboriginal kids. He married when he went to Hobart, but they didn't have any children. Although the wife that he married after 1837 had a daughter. But no, it's impossible to know, although there are many frequent notations or references to what they in those days called half-caste, very tall half-caste women who claimed to be his. So there's no doubt he had them, we just can't, I don't know how we trace it because I think he only had daughters and they can't trace it through. So no one who says they're related to him could, I looked up the genealogy, it's impossible.
Does he have a grave somewhere?
Yes, he does. He has one I haven't been there because I didn't get down to Tasmania, but it is somewhere near the hospital where he died, I believe. So he is buried in Hobart, but I have not been there, to be honest. If you go to Port Phillip around Bellarine Peninsula, there's quite a lot of monuments to him. A few, not many. There's Buckley's Falls, which is a well-known little place just outside Geelong, which is named after him. And there's quite a few little sort of stones and say this is where William Buckley met the John Batman's party. So yeah, he's in the Geelong area. He's a well-known man, but outside, not so well-known. But we got the expression from him, which is a funny thing. Any other question?
Yeah, I only spent 2 years kind of working between the English people and the natives. It was just a 2-year period, wasn't it?
Between 2 years, 1835 to 1837, yeah. Late 1837, I think Batman's people, because Batman came and formed a treaty and said, I have conquered 600,000 hectares or whatever it was. That was, to my memory, June 35, and Buckley would have left, I think, late 37. So it's about 2 and a bit years, yeah. If I'm just getting I'm getting my times right, yeah.
When he went to Tasmania, did he marry a white woman?
Yeah, he married an Irish lady. Apparently she was about 4'11" or 4'10", and he had to prop her up because he was 6'5", and I don't know exactly how they did it, but he had to sort of prop her up. They tied each other. They tied their hands together or something, so that I don't know why exactly, but somehow it propped her up. It's never explained really, but she was a tiny little lady because people were tiny in those days, and a woman of 4'10" or 11" was fairly normal sort of height. Men were only about 5'2" to 5'4". If you're 5'7", which I am, I'd be a tall guy, and I'm a shrimp now. So yeah, she wasn't that short. She was normal height for a woman, I think.
Given he was an escaped convict, why was he not put back into prison?
This is a thing. It's all in the book, but he basically said they basically did a deal with him. You be our interpreter. You talk to the Aboriginal people for us. He spoke Wadawurrung, but the whole area is known as the Kulin Nation around Port Phillip, and it extends. If you look at the geography, extends quite deep into the bush. So in Ballarat, they would still speak Wadawurrung language. So it's quite far back from Port Phillip So he could speak, if he spoke Wadawurrung, he could speak all the languages of Bunwurrung and the Wurundjeri, I mentioned them slightly, also known as the Woiwurrung. So they were the three main tribes, but there were 5, I think, in the nation. Others were a bit further out. So he could speak all the languages pretty much of the entire Port Phillip area, Port Phillip region, right around. So he was the interpreter for everybody. So he could talk to the Woiwurrung in Melbourne, even though he was a Wadawurrung from Geelong, and do all the interpreting. So, sorry, get to your point, answer your question. They said, you be our interpreter and we'll give you a pardon. Which is, and as soon as they found out that there was a white guy who they could talk to, because his English came back after a while, they said, oh, give him a pardon. We need this guy to help us, take over the area, basically. So there was an exchange. So he was forced in a kind of way to be the interpreter. Because if he wasn't, they wouldn't have given him a pardon. They might have sent him to, they might have done, who knows what I'm sure they would have, look, who knows. But in those days, everything was possible. But that was the deal, basically.
So how did you do your research?
Oh, God. You got an hour? Look, I just, the way I research is, I just go, I find everything I can, and I read for the first 4 to 5 months. I don't write anything. It's just the way I do it. Others may do it. I take notes, I do, I've got the story, and as I learn, I get the story I think I'm going to write in my brain. And so you start to collate the notes in different ways. This is for the beginning, this is for the middle, this is for him, and then you have, that's about the Aboriginal culture of kinship, and you'd have notes and papers all over the place, and you're doing it in your brain before you actually write the book itself. And so I just read everything I could. I went down there, I went down to Geelong, I went to see it, I went to see all Buckley's Falls. I didn't go to Tasmania because that was the last. It wasn't, not much happened in his life in the last 20 years of his life from leaving Melbourne onto. And I just read everything I could and spoke to everybody I could. And I was really lucky. I met a man called Fred Carr, who was an expert on the Wadawurrung people from Ballarat. And just by pure, and had written, this is some of the luck you get sometimes as a writer, he had written an extensive book like this with pictures and a whole thing, an academic type book on the Wadawurrung and white people. And here I just go, hello, you're my best friend. And he was brilliant. And he helped me, and he read my first draft. He said, no, he saw lots of mistakes. Because you assume you assume the consequences of, when you write about a culture, you assume something, and you make assumptions that we would as white people make, but they're not always correct. So he just put me on the straight and narrow with so many, and he gave me stories. I was just incredibly lucky. So I was standing on the shoulder of an absolute expert, and his boss, here's Dr. Fred Carr. His boss is, his name is just lapsed, is one of the foremost Aboriginal academics in the country. His name is in the back of the book. I just can't remember offhand. But so I was very lucky. I was being helped by some serious experts here. I spoke to, there's not many, people say to me, well, did you speak to the Aboriginal people down there? There's only about 8 of them who've got Wadawurrung descent, who claim it, and who are able to act. There may be more, but they can actually say that was my grandmother. And so they're not the repository of all the stuff that I needed for this, although they helped in some ways. There's one lady there who helped me with the language. Something to make people understand. I wanted people to understand what Buckley had gone through from how do you cross from English to Wadawurrung language. And she explained the differences in a sort of easy to understand way, his mental processes would have had to change. And I tried to name all the places. I didn't put any, I only put a few Wadawurrung sentences. There's no point. People wouldn't understand it, but and neither did I, but it was nice to get some more. It was nice to know that you can get all the named places. Melbourne was called Bear Brass. And why was it called Bear Brass of all places? This is before it was called Melbourne in 1837, when it was finally become a so-called colony. the name the name of the hill, they called it Batman's Hill in English, just up from the Yarra, had the name of Birrabrook or something like that. I can't pronounce it properly. And it was misheard as Bearbrass, or they anglicised it or something. And so the name of Melbourne is based on a hill just off the Yarra, which is Batman's Hill. Birrabrook, I think, or something like that. And then they changed it to Lord Melbourne, of course, which is what they did. Yeah.
How do the Aboriginal people pass down from generation to generation, all their the protocols and the language and so on?
Yeah.
They didn't have any writing, did they?
No, there was no writing. It was all told in stories and it just went through the generations. I mentioned the bunyip. People say that, here's a funny thing, because not only, it was such a strong legend, the bunyip, which we've all heard about, this funny thing that's swimming in the water. And it's rife throughout, the bunyip is rife throughout Aboriginal culture, not just Melbourne and that Victoria, it's in New South Wales, it's in South Australia. And they reckon that because the Aboriginal people go so far back in their lineage, 60 something, maybe even more 1,000 years ago, there was a thing called the Diprotodon, which was a huge beast, that one of the last surviving huge beasts that Australia had. And they had it as a folk memory. This Diprotodon, which is a ginormous animal, the size of a hippopotamus was practically. And that's where the legend, they think, that we can't know, but that's where some people have said that it may have come from. But the funny thing about the bunyip is such a strong legend that even the settlers, many of the settlers believed it. Fred Carr, the man I mentioned, said to me, it wasn't just an Aboriginal folklore and people laughed at it. Many, many settlers believed they saw it. And what he reckons they saw was possibly a seal or a sea lion that had come up from the coast and was swimming in the lakes, because it was only seen in the lakes. So maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. But people in the 1850s, well into the 20th century, believed in the bunyip. It's not a joke thing that you can laugh about, because people wouldn't joke who lived in the country in those areas. Yep.
Given what we know now about John Batman and how he was a pretty low form of human
Yeah.
and in your opinion, based on how there's a number of places and monuments and things that are named after him, in your opinion, should we be changing that?
Yeah, I get this question all the time. I don't believe, look, this is the culture wars, and yes, I do. The funny thing, I don't know if you've seen Batman's monument down there in Melbourne. You have? There's 3 different plaques on it now, if I remember correctly. What does it say? The first thing to me, it says, we believe he was a great saviour and founder in the first. Second one, I just don't remember exactly, I've got it written down in the book, but it's like we're evolving our feelings about him. In the 90s, they said, well, this guy wasn't so good. Now we're saying, this guy's an absolute bastard. All right? And he was. My personal belief, and people have told me they don't agree with me, and that's fine, is that we should, I don't know, how do we get rid of John Batman? There's something like 30 places in Victoria with Batman Drive. There's even one in Parramatta here. There's a Batman Bridge in Tasmania. There's streets, I think there is a bridge going over the Yarra in Melbourne too, Batman something, and then of course you can't erase, maybe I should get rid of his statue, but I don't want him gotten rid of from the history, because he's part of it. And I think the Victorians have been great in some ways. There are well-known Aboriginal people one called Derrimut, who features in the book. Another artist whose name, this is my brain, this is from driving. There are quite a few, but we should, for every white guy, perhaps we should put an Aboriginal guy there as well. So if we're going to venerate Batman, let's put a statue of Derrimut or other important Aboriginal people, so that we tell the truth. I don't want him to be erased, because it's we can't run away. That's the worst thing. We can't venerate him. Batman's a complex person, and I've only got an opinion. Here's a funny irony you can take or leave if you like, but Batman was the only person to make a treaty with the Aboriginal people. And yes, it was a sham, but how did he know how to do that? Because he understood and knew Aboriginal people from where he had his own horde of Aboriginal people. He would, if you like, unleash on the local population and say, hey, we're nice guys, I've got Aboriginal people too, I've got Indigenous. But by doing that treaty, he was actually saying, and which the British never did, he was saying, it is your land, and I have to negotiate with you to do it. So in a sense, he's more respectful of them in the Victorian sense. In Tasmania, he did some terrible things. They're all there in the book. But he was actually the only person of some kind of official person to actually say, this is your land, I have to negotiate with you. Whereas the British never negotiated with anybody, they just took it. So Batman, yes, he was a horrible character, but he also understood them, and maybe that made him even more sinister because he used and abused his powers of knowledge. I don't know, but he also had 8 Aboriginal guys he worked with. He gave them some land, he loved them, he looked after them. He took on 2 Aboriginal boys. Now that's a stolen generation, or is it a guy who cares? I don't know. I don't think he hated them. I think he was a pragmatic realist who said, if it's in my interest to go against these people and kill them, I'll do it. If it's my interest to be the nice guy and negotiate with them, I'll do that. He was a pragmatist of the worst, of the most cynical kind, no doubt about it. But he was a complex character. He didn't hate Aboriginal people, he didn't want to kill them unless it was in his real interest to do it. You have to remember, John Batman was a currency lad, and people who are currency lads, if you don't know, that means you were Australian born or British. And he was one of the first. He was born in 1801, so he was early currency lad. So he went to live in Tasmania in the 1820s. He got some land there, but there were hardly any currency lads who had land. It was all given to British officers, Napoleonic officers, who came over and treated this John Batman as a second-rate sort of fellow because he's one of them. So he had a chip on his shoulder, and he wanted to prove what the real Batman was, in my opinion, was a man with a huge chip on his shoulder who'd do anything and kill people as a bounty hunter. He would kill people just to get what he wanted. What he really wanted was to be taken in and believed to be one of the top guys. He did deals. He set up he wanted to be a top man. He wanted to be part of the top echelon. And it's all because he had a chip on his shoulder as a currency lad. That's where it all came from. He had to prove himself. And that's what the real John Batman was a man who would do anything, ruthless, to prove that he was top of the tree. And that's how I see him in the book, and I hope that comes through. He's a ruthless killer because it was in his interest in Tasmania to do so. But he was, funnily enough, in Victoria, he caused no trouble at all. He was so sick by that time with syphilis, he really didn't. He may have founded it, but that was the end of it for him. He virtually doesn't even appear very much in the histories of the settlement because he was so sick by the time he got to Victoria. He settled it, and that was pretty much the end of John Batman. He died 4 years later. I think I explained John Batman there. Sorry.
Adam, both in the book and earlier you spoke about how complicated it would have been for Buckley to learn about the Indigenous culture and get immersed in it. And one of the things you talk about in the book mostly is the importance of reciprocation in Indigenous culture.
The what? Sorry? The
reciprocation?
Yeah.
So, do you think, in your opinion and from your research and what you know about who he was as a person, do you think later when he was working for both sides that what he knew about reciprocation in the Indigenous culture was weighing on his mind when making deals with the white man?
What you're saying, that he would have felt strongly that the white people weren't giving back. Oh yeah. I'm trying to remember whether there's any quotes from him on that. But yes, The whole thing, Batman made a treaty, and Batman, as I said, was meant to every year, they made a deal. And there's no doubt this deal was made. And this is where things get a bit... The Aboriginal people understood this deal. There's no doubts about that. Whether it was a true, a real or a fair deal is not there. They understood that Batman was coming with his family and that he would reciprocate. Buckley would have said, maybe at the beginning would have said, okay, it seems fair. Batman's coming with his sheep. There's a small entourage. That might work and we can make it work. I believe that he probably believed it would work at first. It's just that once Batman went there and Faulkner went, Faulkner didn't give two hoots about anything. He wasn't interested in reciprocation, giving back, or anything. Batman made a deal, and on the first year in 1836, he made good on that deal and gave them the things that they asked, which were axes and clothes, and they loved tea, they began to love tobacco, all those things. The Batman did it once, and after that he was so sick, and everyone said, oh, who cares, we don't need to give them anything, we'll just take their land anyway. And that's what happened. Buckley would have seen the deterioration, and he does say, it's just a joke, the whole thing is a joke. This was meant to be done in a proper way, fair way. And let's not forget, I mentioned it very early on, Buckley's farm was taken away from him when he was a baby, 10 years old or something, 8, 10 years old. And he was watching this happen in the second time. And he saw what was happening. There was a story in it where Buckley he was living in Melbourne doing Batman's work, and he went back to Geelong, and he worked out that there was maybe only a quarter of the people he remembered. The rest had died from disease. This is literally 2 years afterwards. See, I get very emotional, sorry. Yeah. People talk about Tasmania, it's a terrible place. And I don't mean this against Melburnians or anything, but what happened in Victoria, in my opinion, was far, far worse. Within 5 years, these people were decimated. It took 25 for it to happen in Tasmania, and only because there was a government decree to go out and kill them. But the first 20 years was pretty good. In Melbourne, the nice times where everybody got on was maybe 1 year, and then it was just bang. And in 5 years, the cattle and the sheep had destroyed the staple food of the Aboriginal, which is the Murnon plant. Without that, all the wallabies went, all the other, and once that was taken away from them, they just starved. And if they didn't, so they had to go to Melbourne to get food, to be looked up, because there was no more land for them. And then they got diseases, the smallpoxes the syphilis and all those terrible influenza. And within 5 to 10 years, by the 1840s, a population of 15,000 was now down to about 2,000 or 3,000 people. And it was just pure destruction. And Melbourne was far, far worse than anything that went on in Tasmania. Not that I want to compare one genocide to another, but the speed of it was outrageous, faster than anywhere else, I think, in the country. Of course, it was a settler frontier thing. Sydney wasn't. It was a convict where they slowly encroached, and Tasmania was also a convict where they slowly encroached on the land and did the same thing, but over a longer period. Melbourne was wham! Thousands of people went with thousands and thousands of cattle, and there was, within 5 to 10 years, there was 1 million sheep in Melbourne. They're just munching away the grass that was the sustenance and the basis of the food chain for the people of the Kulin people of that area. And the destruction was far worse there. In my opinion, other historians might disagree with me, but to me, from what I've read, it's the worst destruction to the Aboriginal people was down there in Melbourne. And that's why when I go to see the Wadawurrung people, there's only 7 of them left. And it's very sad for me. I found it a very, very sad story to write, but very important. Because people didn't know. Most Melbourne people didn't know. I didn't know. I didn't have a clue. So it was a very sad story for me anyway. Sorry?
No. You mentioned 2 figures there. Sort of population of the Aborigines, and then they were brought down to this much smaller number. Sorry, what were the 2 figures again?
Look, I prefer you quoted from the book because it's all in there. Because I don't have them with me. I'm just going from memory.
That's all right. But it was a
But let me tell you something that happened that I do know. They reckon there was 30,000 in 1788 in the Melbourne area, the Kulin people. Now you may not know this. In 1789, smallpox went all the way down the east coast of Australia. There's even a belief, but it cannot be substantiated, that it was deliberately put into the clothes. They used to put smallpox spores and just spread from, because they gave the Aboriginal people clothes, it spread like wildfire all the way down to the south of Victoria. So they lost, in 1789 I think it was, half the population died. There's another smallpox outbreak, which I don't think was deliberate, in 1829, and Buckley talks about it. And that 15,000, I think, look, this is where I get my numbers wrong, but maybe it was 45,000 went to 30,000, and 30,000 went to 15. So from 1788, they lost 2/3 of the people by smallpox, and that was us, again. And then, wham, come the settlers. From 15,000 to 7, within a few years there was only a few thousand. But I don't remember the exact numbers, so please, but they're in the book, and I researched them. But it was halved, what I remember is that each smallpox event halved the entire population. And that wouldn't just be the Melbourne area, that'd be the whole east coast of Australia.
You mentioned Batman died of syphilis.
Yeah.
Did that spread into the Aboriginal people?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, there was sexual relations all over the place, and they were absolutely killed by it because they had no resistance. Whereas whites had 200 or 300 years of resistance to it. A bit like coronavirus. Well, they probably won't suffer from it in 10 years. Well, we get a vaccine, hopefully, God forbid, we hope. But like we don't suffer much from a cold. Influenza would kill them, or at least knock out 9 out of 10. It happened in all kinds of that's how we were so easy for us to settle. It was because there were so few of them. By the time we actually wanted to go, we'd knock the diseases always come out. They always go 5 years ahead of everything until you actually come. You can knock out people not even by being there because runs rife the whole way down the coast. That's why it was so easy for people to just take over, because there weren't very many of them. This is a history we weren't told, and this is what I've learned, and that's why I get emotional about it again.
You mentioned that there was a murder of a settler that triggered slaughter.
Charles Franks, yeah.
I imagine it was a slaughter of what, 200 or 300, or what sort of numbers were you talking about?
They triggered okay, well that's where it became, let me put it this way. First, Charles Franks was killed, so a hunting party went out and killed about 30 people. And then, because it's almost like a precedent. This is what these people are doing to us, says the white people. We have to do it everywhere. We can't let this sort of thing happen everywhere. So then they started going out on hunting parties, or telling them to clear off because they're so scared that the same thing will happen to them. So that triggers a reaction from white people to clear all the Aboriginal people off their land. And that was in 1836, I think, that Franks was killed. And it's like, once these things start, it's okay to do it. And all the niceties of living together all finishes. The first year of Melbourne, there was as many Aboriginal people as there were, but the whites kept coming and coming. And once they knew they were dominant in terms of numbers and had firearms and that, they said, why the hell do we need to share this with them? And then when Charles Franks was killed, even though he was killing Aboriginal people on his land, the slaughter started. I wouldn't say the slaughter. It wasn't like thousands of hunting parties going out to kill people. It's just they were clearing them. They're saying, get out. You can't be here. That's what really happened, which is the same thing in the end.
Thank you.
Yep.
Why do you think we're only learning some of these stories now?
Sorry, I can't hear.
Why do you think we're only learning some of these stories now? Like, you're very passionate about this particular story.
Because
you didn't know about it.
I have this. I ask myself. I blame myself because we don't want to know. We all have this vague sense that we did some pretty bad things and we didn't. I had this bad. There's an argument, and I'm not saying that it's a clear-cut argument. This argument I think on Facebook about did we cause genocide? I don't know if we deliberately did, except I think that they did in Tasmania. I think they actually said we're clearing these people out. I don't think they did in Victoria, But then I hear about things like the smallpox being deliberately, and it had been done in parts of America when they wanted to get rid of native tribes to settle. That was just a practice. That's genocide. That's deliberate killing so that there's no one around. You're splitting hairs as to what is deliberate. If you're going to clear everybody off your land and then say, here's nothing for your efforts, what is it? If I throw somebody out into the desert, that's genocide, isn't it? Even if I didn't pull a trigger. So there's a lot of people are still in denial. I've had so angry at this book because it makes us, oh yeah, you're just being an anti-white guy. I'm not lefty, I'm not a leftist person. I try to be apolitical. I'm not a political person. I'm not trying to prove a leftist point here. I just want to know what the truth is. And unless we know what the truth is, then you make your mind up. But if you still don't believe that we did these things, then you're looking the wrong way. You're looking the other way. So I tell the story as straight as I can. I'm probably slightly left of centre as a person, but not very much. This is not me putting my politics into something, I can promise you that. I came in with an open mind, hoping just to know what happened. And I didn't know these things because you just had to follow the life of Buckley, and when you follow it, you hear these things. So I'm going, I didn't know I was writing about the destruction of Melbourne, except Buckley saw it and commented on it, so there it is, it's all there. So I'm almost coming to it without any pre-knowledge at all. What did I know about the history of Melbourne? I'm from Sydney. I haven't got a clue. And everybody knows only about Sydney anyway. Nobody knows how Melbourne was started. But then there's the other side of people from Melbourne saying, I didn't even know this happened. I didn't know that this place was named after, and you've mentioned this guy in the book. And that's a great thing. You get some really good feedback, because I said, I didn't know either until I wrote it.
So, did you find when you were researching it, did you feel as though there'd been other researchers?
Did I feel what, sorry?
Did you feel as though there were other researchers that had already been in there quite extensively before you, or did you feel like you were one of them?
Look, let's be fair. A guy called Gary Linnell has written. This is the fun part. He's from Geelong. No one had written a book about Buckley since about 1983, and suddenly me and Linnell write the same book within 6 months of each other. He beat me by 6 months. But anyway, he beat me by 6 months, and he'd been researching it, and he's done a pretty good job. No, he has just done a very good job. In fact, he broke some stuff that I didn't know. He found some stuff that nobody knew. He doesn't talk very much about Buckley's life with the Aboriginal people, which is the absolute central thing of this book. Anyway, in my opinion, that's my book. But yes, there's a lot of academic writers who had written bits on the Melbourne. There's a guy who'd written a book called 1835, which details all this stuff. It's not me who started it. I didn't start. I'm standing on the shoulders of giants here. But nobody's done a book that's really, I think, relayed Buckley. What I'm trying to do as a writer is to show a personal experience. I don't want to just tell the story of Melbourne, what happened in Melbourne, and that's been done by a lot of academics, but it hasn't come out in the wider world as a popular writer. I'm a popular historian, so I want to become more popular, you have to write a personal story. So Buckley's was the personal story by which you hear about these events. Not by me just telling them and saying, well, they just put 15,000 sheep and the Aboriginal people were killed, blah, blah, blah. That's there. It's always been there and been there for many years. Oh, actually not that many. Probably since the 90s, these things have been coming out. Most of the stuff I read had been published from the 90s onwards, telling the story. But no one had put Buckley in the centre of it. And neither did Linnell, in my opinion. He told about it, but he didn't link the two. And I think that Buckley's story should be very strongly linked with this destruction and what he saw. Because he made a lot of comments about what the hell is going on here. So yes, there's a lot of researchers. I didn't invent this, I didn't find this story, but what I wanted to do with it, my belief as a writer is to find these great stories that I think have a greater meaning to us, even if it's just about Geelong or that area. it still has a meaning to us here in Bathurst or Sydney or wherever, or Queensland. And I want to pluck them out. That's a ship that never was as well. It was another one that I think told a lot about convict life, even though it was just set in Tasmania. And I'm trying to find those stories that mean more to all of us, and yet maybe local in origin. And there's a lot of those stories, I think, that we can find that have never gone out of their area, if you like. Melburnians and Geelong people, they all know about Buckley, but Sydney people don't. They don't know why we say, or Queensland people. And that's what I want to bring out, and bring the truths of this story, which I think are truths for all of Australia, really. Yeah, of course.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming. That it? Well, thank you very much for coming and listening. I'm really, really, really honoured, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
All right, so that is tonight's event. Thank you all once again for coming. Catherine from Books Plus has copies of The Ghost and the Bounty Hunter should you wish to purchase, and Adam will be signing books. So there you go. So thank you all once again.
Thank you.